Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. My name is Ndape Oshali. Just for your knowledge, we are recording this session, and we have removed the ability for you to um, unmute yourself, but we will put it back later, just so that we don't have any distractions. So welcome. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. As I said, my name is Ndape Oshali. I am the operations manager here at the Henry Nxumalo Foundation, and we are actually having our fifth so far training of this nature. It's free training under the Southern Africa Accountability Journalism Project. So you can look at that. The other trainings are on our website and our YouTube channel. So you can have a look at that if you haven't seen them. They're all geared specifically to journalists within not only Southern Africa, but across Africa and the rest of the world. Today's training is going to be hosted by Daniel, and he's going to tell you a little bit about it when he starts. But I wanted to just start off by giving you a little bit of information about how we go about these trainings, because they are online, firstly, and they are only 1 hour. We try to be as concise as we can be. However, we do make sure that we do two things. Number one is that we do give you an opportunity to ask any questions or any contributions during while the presentation is going on. For that reason, we kindly ask you to put your name if you have any questions from, and whether you are a independent a journalist, or if you're representing a particular organization. And then please write down your question, and ask, highlight up which part of the presentation you're referring to, that just so that when Daniel does come back and answer your questions and address your questions at the end of the presentation, he knows exactly what your question is about. So if there's a particular slide with a title or anything like that, please do refer to that. So your name, surname, where you're from, whether you're a freelance journalist or you're representing an institution, and your question specifying exactly which slide or topic you're asking about. So what we'll also do with that is, so what we'll have is Daniel will talk to you about, he'll present his presentation, and then we'll take your questions in batches. So I will be monitoring the chat. So don't worry about that. We won't miss your questions. We will also collate them. So if you and somebody else ask a similar question, he'll address them at once. And that will be at the end of the presentation, just so that we don't get sidetracked. As I said, we only have an hour. But before we get into that, as I said, we do have 4 other training sessions that are up on our website. They come along with a tip sheet and the presentation itself. So please do have a look at it, or you can also find them on our YouTube channel. And if you're back again, like some of you look very familiar, thank you for being with us on this journey, and welcome back. And I hope that the training is very enriching for you. So Anton, I'm going to hand over to you.
A big welcome. We're glad to see so many participants. Wonderful to have you here and to be engaging with you in this way. I just want to give you some background for those of you who don't know the Henry Nxumalo Foundation well. We're in our 20th year of supporting investigative journalism, mostly by giving grants to journalists to do public interest work. Much of our work has been in South Africa, but more recently we have been giving grants in select Southern African countries, 7 of them in fact. And it's under that umbrella in that project, which is called the South African Accountability Journalism Project, that we're offering this training to you. And just to say that when we give grants in this project, it comes along with the training, and quite intensive involvement in terms of editing, and working alongside with you to ensure that we produce strong, high quality work. But I think that's to everyone's benefit, to ensure that the work we produce is really of the highest quality. I just tell you about another one of our projects at the Henry Nxumalo Foundation, which is of particular interest at the moment. We started a thing called Our City News, which is a virtual newsroom focusing on governance in Johannesburg. Please take a look. It's an interesting new venture. It's called Our City News, and it's at ourcitynews.co.za. And we're very excited about that project. But this is the second year of the Southern Africa Journalism Accountability Project, Accountability Journalism Project, rather, SAAJP. And we had a very good first year with a lot of good work produced, good training, and we're looking forward to a lot of excitement and great stories this year. So welcome everyone. Danielle from Viewfinder is one of our partners, along with Oxpeckers, who are part of the consortium that runs this project. So let me hand over to you, Danielle.
So thanks, everyone. Thanks for the introductions. I think, I've just taken a quick look at everyone's here. I know many of you, we've worked together. We've talked about the issue of sourcing, of investigative practice, about how to convert your ideas into the best possible products and exposés in an investigative journalism sense. Many of you I don't recognize, and I'm very happy to see that there's new people coming into the fold. It's a good time because we'll be issuing a call for proposals from select countries in the region soon. And so I'm really hoping that this presentation and training will feed into your thinking around pitching, process, and ultimately setting yourself up for producing the best possible investigative story, because investigative stories are really about predominantly and fundamentally the source material to which you can gain access to, and the extent to which you are able to deploy that source material to prove wrongdoing, to prove an abuse of power, to move something from an allegation, from denials in response to that allegation, to something more concrete. Oftentimes our investigations start with an allegation, and our job as reporters are fundamentally to convert that allegation through investigation, through reporting, to accessing source material to substantiate what that theory, that allegation, that tip-off has been. And I think oftentimes we don't distinguish properly between what source material really does that and what source material plays more of like a supportive role, a contextual role, valuable nonetheless, but not fundamental to really proving or bringing an expose into life. So just quickly, the ground we're going to cover today. First, we're just going to talk about investigative journalism process and the importance of access and source material sourcing within that process towards delivering on a product in the end. Then we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what do we mean by sources and what are the different types of sources. And here, this is really going to be the bulk of the presentation. We can't cover all the ground around sources, but I think today it would be really valuable if you came away from it being able to distinguish when you're reporting what kind of source material you're engaging with, what the potential of it is, and how to most effectively deploy it. I know I'm speaking in hypothetical, theoretical terms at the moment, but we will ground it in a minute. Then finally, and very briefly, I'm just going to speak about the importance of organizing your source material, manner that you can even present to a third party like an editor before you write it up, and then interpreting it so that your source material translates into proper storytelling and presentation to your audience towards the impact that you want to achieve. Ndapo Shani put up her hand, but I'm just going to continue. If anybody needs to get hold of me, you can send me a WhatsApp. A few things, and then finally a few things that have worked well for me. This is just going to be a fun section looking at some of the things that have have really worked well for me when I've thought about sourcing. And then we're going to hand over to you guys for an open discussion. Any questions that you have during the course of the presentation, write them in the comments box. They'll be collated and we'll address some of them at the end for about 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, so when I talk about process, I often like to think about investigations and how they get started. And for me, generally, it falls into one of two scenarios. As reporters, we've identified there's a problem in the world. It harms people. It harms the public interest. We're not going to write a feature about that problem. There's a lot of journalists that do that, a profile of war or poverty. What we're predominantly interested in as investigative journalists is that we've come to suspect that there's some sort of wrongdoing, often by an institution or people that inhabit that institution or themselves are in positions of power, that aggravates that problem and that harm. We've come to suspect that. We've gone and done some initial groundwork, and we've corroborated that we're onto something. And now, we're not corroborated, we've confirmed that. Now the real work starts. I, as a reporter, now need to investigate my theory, the allegation, my hunch that some sort of wrongdoing has contributed to this problem in the world, and it's harming people, it's harming the public interest. And in order to achieve that, I need to gather source material to be able to prove my hypothesis. And so ultimately, your story is going to be only as strong as that source material. It's not going to be as strong as your hunch or the allegations that people have told you, the hearsay that you've picked up along the way. It's going to be what you can present to your editor and ultimately to your reader. The second scenario, very similar. The hypothesis in our context is wrapped in 1 year. A third party's tipped us off. There's some wrongdoing and it's harming the public interest. This is just an external tip-off as opposed to one that we've generated ourselves. Again, the work that begins now is reporting towards gathering source material to prove that hypothesis. But I think I've covered that. What we often don't think about is what are the categories of sources and how valuable are they going to be in aiding me in being able to prove the allegation, the hypothesis. And so I think the first really clear and important distinction for us to think about is the difference between immaterial and material sources. You guys will recognize this, but it was only until really recently that I've, in my own mind, separated the two out. So immaterial sources are intangible, they're human derived. This is like the conversations that you are having on the phone with people. This is like testimony that was given. That is in contrast to pretty much all other source material, which is tangible, inspectable source material. So where do these originate from? The one comes from people's knowledge, people's memory, people's opinion, people's interpretation, people's experience. People. That is the common denominator there. The other sources, which are material sources, these are anything that you can see, hold, verify independently, and show to other people. Okay, so the one is really just contained within a human being's experience, opinion. The other one is a physical, tangible source. So here again, I've made this point, but interviews, testimonies, insider accounts, explanations, opinions, conversations, interpretations. The other side, of course, involves everything else: documentary sources, contracts, invoices, court filings, emails, WhatsApp messages, databases, spreadsheets, photos, videos, satellite, audio recording, physical evidence, laws and regulations, right? I often think that the law is a great source against which to test whether something that has happened was legal or not, right? That's not an opinion. You can root that argument in a source, which is the law, the regulation that governs how something should happen. Immaterial sources are mediated through people, through human beings. Material sources are ones that exist independently of somebody's memory, of their opinion, of their claim, of their allegation. They tangible. So why does this distinction matter? Well, often human sources, the tip-offs that we receive and the conversations that we have, that's the door that is open to us, where we start acquiring insights. We start putting things together. We start informing ourselves as to what's happening. But we know well that that is not enough, right? Nobody is going to, our expose is not going to be strong if it's exclusively based on the knowledge that we've acquired through just speaking to other people and quoting that and attributing it to them. For instance, somebody says something happened, and we just attribute it to them, and we say, this person says something happened. We can all see how fallible that potentially can be. Material and documentary sources, they are much harder to contradict and to challenge. And these are the ones that should carry your story. These are the ones that you are seeking to pursue after you've got that human source that has tipped you off to something. And almost always it comes from a human source, those initial tip-offs or those initial hunches. So what is a common mistake that I often see reporters make that we're editing? They've got in their original immaterial human source to tip them off on something. And then right through their reporting, they rely way too heavily on that, on people's testimony, no matter how compelling that testimony may be. What they don't do is they don't make a concerted effort, a concerted mission to find the documentary sources to back up what they have heard from other people. So how does this mistake creep in from day-to-day reporting? So for me, fundamentally, reporters see the human sources that they have access to wrong. They see them as people to interview, as quotes to get, and to put in their stories. And often these quotes are like 300 words long or 200 words long, and they just lose the reader completely. Whereas where I really think what the reporters should be doing is they should see their human sources as gateways, as the key often to unlock the material sources that are needed, the evidence that is needed to back up what they have heard from people. So how do we avoid this mistake generally? First of all, you must always have a radar on when you are speaking to people. When you're interviewing people, you must look out for any reference to a potential document, material source, something that can corroborate what that person is saying beyond just their own words. You need to assume that you can't rely on their words, and you need to look for them to be a signifier, a pointer, a connector to the source material that you need to be able to back up what they know and what they're imparting on you as knowledge. And you must always assume that that material evidence exists to prove that allegation. I'm going to use some examples in a minute, so if this is a bit hypothetical, just bear with me. What you need to recognize as well is that no matter how good your whistleblower and intentioned and even the victim or whoever, the expert, whoever you happen to be speaking to, they are usually just going to speak to you about what they know. They're not going to sit there with a dossier of documentation that they are going to volunteer to you, even though they might want to or would be willing to if you ask them for it. So you need to always be raising that issue. Wow, that's interesting what you said there. How do you think, obviously we can't rely on your words exclusively. My editor won't accept that, but we really want to make that point. So can you kind of explain to me, how do you think somebody like me would prove that point if I had to rely on, external source material? And that's often where that discussion will open up, and the person will be prompted and they will help you. And that's really been very valuable to me in terms of my relationship with human sources, especially human sources that have a lot of knowledge and can impart a lot of things on you, but their words are often not enough. And so you have to take that further with them and ask them, how are we going to do this? So here's a very simple interaction. So, and these are all from real examples, by the way, obviously just anonymized, etc. But a victim in an interview says, well, this guy, he did actually ask me to pay a bribe. And stupidly I did. And, whatever he was promising me, it never came to fruition. So the wrong reaction for you to have as a journalist in a scenario of hearing something like that is like saying to yourself, wow, that's so interesting. I'm going to just quote this victim as saying she paid a bribe of $1,000 on whatever date. This is a missed opportunity if you do that. What you actually should do, and you should do this in every scenario where you hear of information that might exist out there that you think would be valuable to your investigation. You don't say, wow, I'm going to put this in a quote later. You say, wow, that's hectic. But we're really working with a high burden of proof here. Is there perhaps a record of him asking you this? Is there perhaps a documentation of the bank transfer? That you'd be surprised at how often a source comes back and says, yes, of course, no, it happened on WhatsApp. I can send you a screen grab, and the payment is reflected on my bank statements. Would you like access to these? If you don't ask, and if you don't know how to have your radar primed for those opportunities, you are going to be sitting with secondhand hearsay material, whereas you would have had an opportunity to have the real tangible documentary source material available to prove that point. It's going to be way more difficult for this person that solicited the bribe to speak against a WhatsApp that's associated with their number and a bank transfer into their bank account, say, hypothetically, than just a quote from somebody that you interviewed at a taxi rank or wherever that might have been. So this is the breakthrough that you're looking for, and it comes to you when you have your radar primed for potential material evidence, as opposed to just thinking always that you can. This is a scenario from my own reporting. One of the breakthroughs that kicked off, a couple of years of investigation for me into police misconduct in South Africa. I found a whistleblower up, and he said to me, yeah, it's true. My colleagues, they close. This person had testified at a commission of inquiry, so he was already in the public domain, but nobody had really delved into what he was saying. So I phoned him up, and he said, yeah, it's true. My colleagues, they close hundreds of uninvestigated police brutality cases every year. And they do it just so that they can inflate performance statistics. Okay. So the wrong reaction for me to have in that scenario would be like, wow, this is an explosive claim. And this is a whistleblower who's in the organization. So I'm just going to quote this person, and that's going to be strong for my story. Okay, later he responds and he says, no, he doesn't want to be quoted, even anonymously, Okay, suddenly you had a dead end. So, the right reaction to have, on the contrary, is to say, wow, that's crazy. How can we prove it? What records do you think is out there? Do you have the knowledge as a person inside the system? I don't know. Can you help me? Do you know what records will show this? And can you give them to me? Well, in this instance, the person didn't have access to those records, but he gave me a specific indication of the type of record I would be looking for. And he said, you know what, if you submit a PIA public records request, you might just get it. All right. I did that. And lo and behold, the records came back. And what they showed me was proof. At the end of the financial year, all these investigators went into a room together and they just closed thousands of cases. Now, that's not proof that those are uninvestigated cases, but you can corroborate that otherwise. But that was the breakthrough, right? This source, instead of just quoting him, the source was then a key, a gateway into actually the source material that you need to substantiate this explosive claim. So from the smallest thing, okay, paying $1,000 bribe is not a small thing, but to something that is systemic across an entire institution, the same principle applies. You're always screening for an opportunity to corroborate what somebody has said, an explosive allegation they've made, asking them what source material I can rely on. If they don't know, your next question is, who should I speak to? Who might know? Who would be able to help me with that? You're constantly following the breadcrumbs, and remember, you're assuming the record's out there. The only blockage to you getting it is not having access to the right person or the right process, like the PIA request, which he alerted me to. Then, okay, we'll just pause there for a second. So that is material, human sources, the allegations that people make, the opinions they have, the insights they've gained. That's really valuable. You have a lot of those conversations. I don't want to give the impression that we don't value those, but you have to deploy them correctly. For fear of running out of time, I'm going to go a little bit faster. I think many of you guys would recognize the difference between primary and secondary sources, but it's valuable to raise this. So this is another category that you can apply a distinction when you're looking at a source. And you've got to, excuse me, the material and immaterial sources at the top, those aren't the right headings. It's supposed to be primary and secondary. So primary sources are the ones that are closest to the event or the thing that happened. Secondary sources are ones that are at least 1 or 2 steps removed. So primary sources, we're looking at direct evidence or first-hand accounts. Often it is original and exclusive if you get access to that, because secondary by nature has already been out in the public sphere often. Secondary sources are their interpretations, their analyses, their summaries of primary evidence. They are rarely original and exclusive, even if it is an interview with an expert, right? That expert has given that analysis 1,000 times before. So primary sources, they're people that have witnessed or participated in something. They're original documents or records that created at the time of an event, records, right? They're direct observations by a journalist. So like you're in the field, you see something with your own hand, your own eyes, you're writing it with your own hand, you are 1 degree separated from what you have seen. So that is a really good example of a primary source. It's like your field reporting notes, going out and corroborating something with your own eyes. Secondary, on the other hand, is analysts, experts, reports written after the fact, media coverage, academic studies, NGO reports, etc. And more examples of what this kind of primary sources would be. Procurement officer that was directly involved in awarding a tender. Whereas a secondary source would be an expert explaining something that, after the fact, relying perhaps on primary sources themselves, or perhaps he's also relying on secondary sources. A report by an NGO, they might have got primary sources, they've done a survey, but their report itself is a secondary source. The survey is the primary source. I think you guys would understand this distinction, but you'd be surprised at how often reporters make this mistake. They don't distinguish between what is really original, primary, first-hand, valuable, exclusive source material, and what's like secondary, background, expert interpretation, commentary, reports, other news media. And so that is one of the big things that I would like for you guys to take away. Look at the source material that you have access to and ask yourself, what is truly primary here and what kind of primary sources are out there that I could benefit from accessing, and how would I go about that? It really results in missed opportunities. And what it also happens is it buries the lead. So you have access to something original, but you choose rather to lead your story on all the background and the stuff that you basically read on Wikipedia, the statistics that everybody's already known about, and then maybe paragraph 10, you say, and we spoke to we exclusively spoke to an insider whistleblower and they gave us access to this. No, you have got to elevate your storytelling on the strength of your sources and on what is your strongest source. And oftentimes that's going to be your primary source, not something that you picked up secondhand, but something that only you have access to, and that is only 1 or 2 degrees removed from the reality. A big mistake that I see very often is that journalists rely on secondary sources to make primary claims, which means, they would rely on an expert to make a claim that they just accept without corroborating it with reference to what the source material for that claim actually is. Okay, just 2 more slides that I kind of tacked on at the end, and then we'll hand over to some questions. The first thing is, at any point in your investigation, you should be able to take a step back and you should be able to ask yourself, what actual source material do I have in hand at the moment? An interview, I know that I was saying humans are immaterial sources, but an interview can serve its function on record, quotable, that is a document that you can show somebody, whereas the conversation itself, isn't. So you should be able to list what source material you have in your hand at any moment. Don't tell your editor. The editor's not interested in what you think about something and blah, 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 and what you've kind of deduced. He or she wants to know, what list of source material do you have in your hand? And the second thing that you want to ask yourself is, if I was given a little bit more time, what are the highest priority sources that I have identified that probably exist that I should really make a concerted push to try and secure, right? These are the 2 questions, or the list and that question. You should be stepping back at least once a week. And this is where you're going to see whether you're making progress or not as well, is whether that list of source material is growing and becoming richer and more elucidating of the thing that you're trying to prove, or whether it's stagnating. It's a very good litmus test for how healthy your investigation is progressing. And then how to interpret these sources. Well, just to have them isn't sufficient. So you really need to always look at every source on your list, and you need to ask yourself, what kind of source is this? Is it immaterial, which isn't going to be very helpful to you? It's just somebody's hearsay. Or is it material? Is it something tangible that is going to be very difficult to refute if I put it out there? Is it a primary source? Very valuable, exclusive, only I have access to this? Or is it a secondary source, which is maybe valuable to provide a little bit of context to the reader, but it's not fundamental to the originality of the investigation and the expose that I'm putting out there? So you ask that question, and you allocate to each of them. Primary sources are going to be your most valuable. Material sources are going to be the most difficult to refute. Primary material sources, right? Those 2 grouped together. Primary and immaterial sources, like, an eyewitness to a crime, that could be very valuable as well, but it would be a hell of a lot stronger if it was backed up by some tangible material sources as well. So you've got to ask yourself, how valuable is this source, and really, like what contribution does it make to proving my hypothesis, right? And how am I going to employ it in a story? A story has got only a certain number of words, and it's got a word limit to it. So you have to think, what is the best way that I can reference this source and employ it in my story? What you don't want to do is you don't want to quote 7 paragraphs from it. You want to be able to write a sentence or 2 that gives the essence of what that source shows us to the reader. Okay, I'm going to just end up, we're almost out of time. My time's certainly almost done. But I'm just going to say, and I knew that this was going to happen. That's why all 4 of these things are on the last slide. But I'll just quickly run through them. Things that have really, really worked for me really well. Number 1, you build relationships with your human sources. You don't see them as things to extract from. You don't see them as like people to quickly interview. If they are valuable and they know their stuff, the better you build your relationship with them over time, the more they are likely to reciprocate, the more they are likely to educate you, and the more they are likely to lead you to the material evidence that you need to be able to prove your story. One of the best ways to build your relationship is don't only ask them questions. You go and do your research, and then you phone them back and you say, wow, that conversation we had the other day really got me thinking. So I went and looked into this and that, and this is what I found. What do you think of that? So you bring something to it. You make the conversation stimulating to them as well as to you. And these sources, that they love talking about their stuff, their areas of expertise. Another thing that worked really well in the one investigation we did is building your own database. So the allegation was that a whole bunch of Zimbabwe nationals were recruited by ZANU-PF to vote for Frelimo in the Mozambican elections next door in Masvingo province. How are we going to corroborate this? Well, these journalists, they had access to a whole bunch of people that said that they had done this. So I said to them, well, systematically start listing them, take photographs of their voter ID cards, ask them the same questions, like a survey almost. What's the output of a survey? Is your own database. And so think about that possibility. If data doesn't exist for your story, why not make it? All you have to do for a survey to have some sort of legitimacy is maybe do 10 or 20 interviews with people. And as an investigative journalist, 20 interviews, you should bulk at 20 interviews. You do that in 2 days. Using right of reply as a source. Engage the target of your investigation early. Ask them questions in a constructive way so that you can extract more information out of them. We can talk about that. I won't go deeply into it. And then finally, do not underestimate the value of actually physically going somewhere to verify something, to see it with your own eyes. A lot of reporting happens on our desktops these days, but some of the most powerful and quick and sure ways to generate primary, valuable, original source material is through your own engagement with what's happening out in the real world. Okay, so at that, I'm going to hand over to a few questions. We've got 12 minutes on the hour, but if we run a little bit over, anyone who would like to stay, I'm sure Ndapo Shali will allow that. And at the end, I'll give my email address so that if anybody has follow-up, I'd be very happy to engage with you on that. Okay, I've got to see if I can make Ndapo Shali host. Yes. I think I've done it. But she's disappeared. Bear with me, folks. Wow, we're going to have to do this better next time. Make host. Ndapo Shali, I think you're going to have to phone me on WhatsApp again because I'm clicking make host and nothing is happening. Folks, just give us 1 minute. We're just going to make the change over here.
Okay, so I think I'm audible. All right. So sorry for this, everybody. You would think that after so many years on Zoom, we would have gotten this right at this point, but we live and we learn. Thank you very much, Daniel. We have a lot of positive feedback from our participants. We have 3 questions right now. So I'm just going to ask everybody who isn't speaking to kindly unmute themselves. To kindly mute themselves. Otherwise, we're going to have a little bit we're going to have some disturbances. And then for those of you who've got your hands raised, I'd like to ask you to please, rather than raise your hand, to just put them in the chat so that I don't miss them. So Danielle, if you're ready, I'm going to start with the first 3 questions we have, and then we can, while others, if they need the time to write them down, can go ahead. So Mapula Lehodi is a journalist from SA, and they're asking, is an investigative piece weak if the journalist couldn't speak to someone but relied on material sources as well as clips taken from, for example, a commission of inquiry or an online clip by a whistleblower in a case where there are challenges with getting them to actually speak? So would you like to address that first, Daniel?
You broke up a little bit, but I gathered that what we have in hand here is there was a commission of inquiry, and we have what the testimony was, and we're having challenges to get people to speak to us. Okay, so a commission of inquiry and testimony, though, for an investigative journalist, that might be a really valuable indicator of something to follow up on, but that's both a secondary source. Okay, commission of inquiry, it's already been kind of put out there, the transcript at least, and it's an immaterial source, so it's a person, right? And so the value for me in that would generally be generating leads for me to follow up on and continue on. So, good example, like I cited earlier. Sorry, I'm just going to mute this gentleman, whoever this is. Oh gosh. Okay. Sorry, guys, we need to mute ourselves. So a commission of inquiry is a good example because very often there are things that are said in commission of inquiries that are broadcast to the whole world, but 90% of the journalists are reading it like a news reporter, and they just take the soundbite and they're putting it out there and they forget about it. But often the consequence of what's being said at commission of inquiries is so dramatic that you really think, wow, if I could only get the evidence to further corroborate that thing, that would be a huge expose. And that's actually what some of my work has been based on. So yes, your first port of call will be to try and get that person to speak to you. But if they don't, the cat's already out the bag. And so you can start speaking to other people that might bear knowledge on the disclosures that were made in the commission of inquiry to try and gather that evidence further. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Mapula is very welcome to hit me up or email me if she wants to chat further.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. We have another question from Mohosi. Mohosi is a journalist from SA, and he'd like to find out if access is power, how do investigative journalists ensure they are not co-opted by the very same systems they're scrutinizing?
Well, I think this is one of the most important, and I should have actually spoken to this more, but this is where human immaterial sources, human-generated source material, which is basically opinions, allegations, interpretations from people, is potentially most fallible, because there's always a motivation behind somebody's disclosure and willingness to put something forward. Sometimes that motivation is purely sincere. They really have seen something terrible that has happened, and they want to alert the public to it. At other times, that person has got a nefarious motivation. Anton can speak a lot to this, I think, and about the journalist's responsibility to try and discern and distinguish what is this motivation, what information might this person be withholding that doesn't support the thing that they're putting out there. And is it a selfish motivation, or is there something really objectively worth the public interest kind of disclosure and exposure of this issue? Anton might be looking to unmute himself, but I would really appreciate to hear more from him, because his book, for the record, very much dealt with issues of motivation of whistleblowers during the state capture era.
So thank you, Danielle. Yes, my book deals with a situation in which a well-known and prominent investigative team from what was at that time our biggest national newspaper, the Sunday Times, got, in a sense, sucked into carrying one particular version of a story that came from sources within our tax office, our revenue services. And it was a absolute perfect example of how they allowed themselves to be led into a dark hole, a dark place, because one particular agenda was being sold. So what it really points to is the need to be absolutely aware of your sources, and what their motivation is, so that you can assess it, and to require the backup material that supports, so you're not just relying on them talking and leaking information to you, but that you're looking for documentary support. And finally, that you do remain open to counter narratives, counter versions, other things that may come out. Their problem was they stopped listening to people saying your sources are bad, your sources are misleading you, and they got trapped in that. You know, there's nothing more important to a journalist than their independence. And a lot of that exists in your head about thinking independently, clearly, and critically all the time. So questioning your sources, questioning the material you get, and being adamant that you're going to make your decisions based on verification and close analysis, to avoid that kind of disaster. Shall we move to the next question, Danielle?
Okay, Danielle, we have a couple of questions. Unfortunately, they didn't write their names, but I'm sure you can give us an answer regardless. So the first one says, what safety protocol should I follow when contacting politically sensitive sources?
There's not a lot in that question, so I'm not entirely sure what it's asking, but what I would say is that you need to do an assessment of risk for just about everything that you do when you're dealing with politically sensitive stuff, or sensitive stuff in general, criminally sensitive stuff. Anything that could put you or a source in line for your source, first of all, for exposure, or second of all, for danger. So you need to do an assessment, and you need to be able to make your call on that assessment. But just contacting a source, you know, that initial outreach, that shouldn't come with a huge amount of risk. It depends on how that relationship progresses and what kind of disclosures come from it, and how you need to secure both the integrity of that source and their safety, and your own, for that matter. I don't know if anyone else has something to add on that, but I think it's really just about making a sober assessment as you're going along. But for me, I don't think that initial outreach is usually a very high risk scenario. It's more the continuation of that relationship, and ensuring that you anticipate risk as that develops.
Danielle, can I add to what you said?
Please go ahead.
Yes. At the beginning of every story, we ask everyone to fill in a risk assessment form. And, the main purpose of that is to make you think about ask certain questions of yourself and understand the range of issues you need to think about in risk assessment. So that form is very useful to prompt your thinking. Please also look at our training video on safety, and let us know if you're working on a story with us, whether you need more direct, more personal advice on that. On phoning a political person, if they're starting to give you sensitive information, I think you want to think about more secure communication than an ordinary phone call. And there's various apps you can use to encrypt your phone call to increase the level of security. I don't think we can go much further at this stage, but watch the training video.
Okay, and then I've got a couple of questions that are coming in. So if anybody needs to leave, just a reminder that we are recording this and we will put it up online. We will send you an email within the next week or so once it's up on our website. But in the meantime, we have a question from Henry Mango, who is an investigative journalist from Malawi. How can a journalist make an investigative story still relevant in dire situations where he can only have immaterial sources? Daniel?
Immaterial sources, okay, we're talking about just relying on what people are telling you. Now, I don't know what scenario would arise where you would be completely and utterly blocked from even trying to attempt to find any documentary evidence to back up what somebody's telling you. But because by virtue of somebody telling you, they know something. And sorry, people, I just need to make sure that we don't have interruptions coming through the line. So, okay, so I think Henry's pointing to a scenario where, the journalist feels like they need to be, they're predominantly reliant on what people tell you. And this is what I'm exactly asking you to guard against, that you don't just fall in a pattern of feeling like your human sources and what they tell you is the only thing that you're ever going to be able to get access to. Because if you do that, you're going to stop being critical and trying to follow the allegations to the source material that might be able to corroborate that independently of what this person has told you, verify it, right? Okay, but now let's say in the scenario where is a human source valuable on its own, in its own right, even if they can't provide you with any documentary backup? Well, I think the most valuable ones are going to be your primary sources, people that were directly involved, maybe in a cover-up, a crime, corruption. Those are, I mean, I interviewed a police officer not long ago who, well, it's a while ago now, who admitted to me to having committed torture on a regular basis in his office, and I was interviewing him in his office. So, but that was auxiliary or contributory to a whole bunch of documentary evidence that I had already gathered that torture was happening specifically in this province, KwaZulu-Natal. And so that was very valuable because it was exclusive, primary, even though it was kind of hearsay and he didn't provide me with any physical evidence. It was in person, so I was in the office. I could see the office. I could see the chair where he tortured people, and he told me about it. That is very valuable, even though there wasn't documentary evidence there. Just on its own, maybe it could have been valuable as well, but with the context of police brutality and what we know about that in South Africa. But it was certainly an addition to evidence and source material that was of a real tangible nature. And I think that is an example of where a human source might be really, really valuable to you, but it's often not enough to just base your entire investigation just on what some people told you.
Thanks, Danielle. Then our next question. So we do have quite a few. So Sarah from Malawi is asking on source. She says, I'm curious on sources. What's the most challenging source you've ever come across, and how did you handle it?
Not sure what makes a source challenging. So I've mentioned that the bulk of my work before I started focusing predominantly on editing, which I'm doing now a lot of with some of you guys, was on police misconduct in South Africa. So the most challenging source actually was probably getting a dump of 60,000 criminal complaints against the police, in a database. To interpret that material, to go through it, to understand the process by which it was generated and what that showed us about the dysfunction in the accountability mechanisms for police officers, that took an inordinate amount of challenging work. A lot of phone calls, a lot of reading of laws, regulations, understanding how these institutions functioned, and not just how institutions functioned, but how individual cases progressed through those institutions. That was probably the biggest kind of single source that caused me the biggest challenge, but it ended up being pretty much the most valuable source. The most difficult access I've ever had to overcome challenge, that was the one I just mentioned. Finding a South African police service officer in South Africa to admit to me on record, even though anonymously, to having routinely committed torture as part of his job, and that it was cultural and systemic. We knew that, but we never heard it from a police officer themselves. And that took months and months and months of trust building and referral to the right person within the police service that was willing to talk to us about that, to admit to a crime that carries, up to a 20-year jail sentence in South Africa. So yeah, that was probably the most difficult access that I've had to negotiate in my time. And yeah, it came off, but it takes months sometimes to get something like that to come off. And that's why we can't be in a rush. We can't look to the first person that we speak to just put a quotation marks around something that they told us, when in actual fact, that person over a few weeks could lead us to something much more explosive, because this source came to me through almost like a broken telephone of a number of people. I was referred from here to here to here until eventually I got to there.
Just a reminder to everybody to please subscribe for our newsletter. I've shared the link in the chat. A lot of the information we share here and other opportunities are also shared in our newsletter. Danielle Rodney from South Africa would like to know, if the PAIA request is declined and I submit a revised second application, but the institution delays responding in what appears to be an attempt to delay my investigation, how do I go about that?
So I've given one example of where PIA request really came off. The PIA request in South Africa is a formal government records request. I know that you're not really able to do that in many other African countries, so excuse the lack of relevance if that is the case in your country, and we can talk about other ways that you might go about that in other settings like Zimbabwe and etc. But in South Africa, hypothetically, it's supposed to work well. I talked about a scenario where it did work well. Very, very often, even in my own experience, it doesn't work well. So this is not an isolated kind of example. Very rarely does the institution disclose the records within the right period of time. I think the best you can do in that scenario is, well, there's a formal process to follow. So the first thing that you do is you wait 60 days. If the appeal isn't properly responded to, or if it's denied in a way that you don't agree, you can appeal to the executive director of, unfortunately, that very institution that has denied you, and they can make an independent ruling on whether their legal services department were correct. Oftentimes, they'll support their guys against you, but that is a mandatory step. And then, of course, the next step is to lodge a formal complaint with the information regulator, which is kind of like an ombudsman, right? An independent body that makes a determination on the balance of your complaint, what the law says in terms of disclosure, and whether it was legal. Now, this to deny you the records, and it can make an order that's enforceable that the record should be given to you. That seems like a very long process, but we're often working on pet projects. They're not our main focus, and you'd be surprised at how quickly 3 months goes by, and then you have determination, and sometimes an absolutely explosive record comes back to you. And then you can use that as part of your reporting. Well, we fought tooth and nail, and they denied us at every turn. They denied our prior requests, etc. If you don't have luck with the information regulator, well, then maybe get a legal opinion saying we don't see that this should have been denied, and make that part of your story. The fact that you have been blocked from accessing information that is really in the public interest, and that even the fact that that information wasn't disclosed can be deployed as a source indicating, lack of transparency, wrongdoing by the institution under investigation. Or you can look for a leak. You can ask somebody to leak it to you, but that's usually quite hard to realize.
Okay, we have two more questions, and I see one just came in from Malawi. So the question from Malawi, please share your name if you're comfortable with, under your question. We have question from Etienne from Cameroon. How can one strive in a situation where the environment doesn't give room for you to investigate? Once you start an investigation, many authorities see you as unpatriotic. That's the question.
Yeah. So, I think we must recognize that our colleagues in other African and Southern African countries, they don't, they're in incredibly fraught political environment, and the risks of their work, especially if it involves corruption and actors in the state, is huge. The only thing that I can suggest in a scenario like that is to build a network of support around you, to work to make absolutely certain that you have both domestically within the country support of editors or activists that have an interest in holding government accountable. As in a way, we are civil society.
Wesley, could you please mute yourself, Wesley?
Don't worry, I'm muting them. And then internationally, there are networks of support for journalists. The accusation that you're unpatriotic, well, if you're looking into something that is truly in the public interest, we know that is just kind of propaganda then, if you're being accused of that. Although it comes with massive risk. And I think that you should be able to soberly assess that risk and make sure that you're insulated as your communication, and that your physical safety is insulated, protected as much as you're able to before progressing. But of course, getting the backing of big domestic or international networks of support is probably your best way of insulating yourself from further risk.
Thank you. One more question, two more questions. Chris from South Africa is asking, he has two questions. What is the best way to navigate sources who are willing to give explosive and insightful details on a story, but would like to remain anonymous? And then can you share some of these easily available websites or databases we can use to access documents for stories? This is for the South African context.
Okay, so Chris, this is the challenge that we're dealing with, right? A lot of people want to. We can do a whole thing on anonymous sourcing and whether somebody's on record and anonymous, on record by their name, off record, which means you can't quote them even anonymously, or on background. Off record means you can't even use the information. you just know it, right? And maybe you can look for third ways to corroborate that information. On background means you can kind of use that information, you just can't publish it. So these are all the different terms on which you can speak to a source. An anonymous source, this is exactly what I'm guarding against, that an anonymous source tells you something explosive and that you think that attributing it to them anonymously is sufficient. As an editor, I see a lot of that. Anonymous sources that, the journalist doesn't even bother telling the editor sometimes who the source is. So we just see anonymous and a quote. And that really isn't sufficient, guys. Anonymous sources can sometimes be quoted in stories, but they can't be the entire story. There needs to be something that you have uncovered that holds the story, irregardless of a contribution from an anonymous source. And so usually when you get a tip off or an insight or an allegation or information from a source, your first question to them should be, I can't quote you. My editor has trouble with quoting anonymous sources. Please, we need to put this information out there. Help me find a way to substantiate and verify what you've just told me, which isn't reliant on the quotation marks around your words. And they will understand that 100%, you know? And so that is a scenario where you build your relationship with an anonymous source, but you don't see them as something that you're going to quote because you know that it's going to be much more powerful if that anonymous source can help you access verifiable material documentary evidence rather than just providing you with a quote, which is attributed to an anonymous source, which is very fallible, really, and very easy to deny, especially because this is a nameless, faceless person who's made these claims or allegations.
Okay, we've got two questions from Zimbabwe. One is from Walter. Walter says, I have encountered a situation where a highly trusted source tells me about a highly sensitive story involving high officers. Everything here is high, okay? I asked for the documents. He tells me it's difficult because I have to sign for the documents, right? In such a case, how do we handle the story? Should we drop it because we do not have the documents? That's the one question. Maybe we can start with that, then I'll get to the second question.
You need to, what you're not going to be able to do is quote the anonymous allegation and make that the basis of your story. So that for you is the indicator, the gateway that some wrongdoing has been committed. If he can't sign for those documents, you have to have a workshop with this guy basically and say, listen, we really have to get this out there in some way. What ideas do you have? We don't know how this department works. We don't know how what to do. We're not going to be able to quote you anonymously. And trust me, like you try and build a story around an anonymous allegation, like it's going to fall flat. And if your editor doesn't, call it out, the publication is going to be weak and it doesn't deserve to be anywhere near page one of your newspaper. So you're in a bind there, but you have the fact that this is that you trust that whatever wrongdoing has happened. So you've got to problem solve, and you've got to think of creative ways. Remember how I said you build your own database if the database doesn't exist? That's an example of problem solving where you take what might be out there and you generate source material. So maybe you want to start looking at other people that you could speak to that has some bearing on this knowledge and asking for their cooperation. But what you're not going to be able to do is to throw your hands up and say, well, we don't have more, so we'll just quote an anonymous allegation because that's the best we can do. That's not the kind of story that I'm going to want to publish, and I don't think you'll get a lot of love from investigative editors if you try and convince them that this is the best that we've got and that we should go with it.
Thanks, Danielle. And the question was also, I think to clarify that the journalist, Walter, saying that he would have to sign for these documents.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought The
No,
official.
not the informant. No, so he would have to sign in this office for these documents.
So what's wrong with
So
that? Does
I
Walter
don't
feel
know.
that he's going to be exposed for getting access to these documents? I'm not, I don't
I'd
understand. You'll
assume
have to
so.
email me.
Yes, Walter,
I thought
you've
that
got
the source
Danielle's
didn't want
contact.
to expose themselves by signing for the documents.
No, no. Okay, so Walter, I guess you can follow up. You can follow up with Danielle with that. And then another question from Malawi. Some material sources are protected by laws. In Malawi, some material sources are protected by laws. For example, we have protected emblems and others. This makes journalists to rely mainly on immaterial sources. What advice can you give us on such situations when the laws on the other give access to information laws, on the other hand takes us, I guess, takes using protected names, emblems, etc. I'm not sure if I understand this question fully. I guess the question is mainly on what to do with material sources that are protected by law and so the journalists can't use them.
Um, Many of these questions, they're appealing to, they're trying to make a case for not actually getting evidence, right? They're saying like, we don't have a choice. We have to just rely on immaterial sources. What I'm saying is that you have to find creative ways to convert the anonymous hearsay, it is hearsay until you've got evidence, allegation from a human person, right, into something that you can publish. Maybe you can still include a quote from that human person in your story as an anonymous whistleblower if you want. Personally, I always saw, human sources as more valuable if they can give me access to things than somebody to quote. I almost never quote my whistleblowers in my stories because I don't need to, because they've given me independent source material. They've led me to the right things that I can rely on, that is infallible, that is documentary. And so a lot of these questions, I take as journalists trying to make the case for like, we can't get access to actual documentary sources. Sometimes that's not the case, but that is the case. But in many, many scenarios, I think journalists miss opportunities to think creatively, to go out and verify on boots on the ground with their own eyes and a cell phone, taking photographs of things. Okay, documents are a different type of scenario, but you have to try and convert what you've heard from people into something that you can manifest and something manifest that you can show to an editor and to your readers. What I'm trying to get us away from is just thinking that you can quote an interview with an anonymous whistleblower and that is sufficient. We see that a lot. And I'm telling you now that it is not sufficient. So if that's the only thing that you'll be able to render at the end of your investigation, maybe you shouldn't have pitched the story in the first place. You probably need a little bit more than that at the stage of pitching in any case before the story is going to be greenlit. That's going to be part of your groundwork to get some provisional evidence and source material. So yeah, I know it's tough to hear this, but this is the kind of approach that will take you from somebody who is publishing stories that aren't really substantiated to somebody that does the groundwork to convert what you've heard into something that is grounded in real evidence. And I know we've been speaking in quite general terms. I'm very happy to engage with you guys on your specific challenges, on whatever stories you're working on, whether you commission to the SAJP or not. If you email me at any point and you've got a specific question about sources and challenges, this is, I love this stuff, so I'd be very happy to engage with you on it.
And as a segue from that, it's one last question that's actually very specific, Daniel. So this is McDonald from Zimbabwe, and he's saying that I'm working on an economic imbalance story where big companies are having access to green loans due to their bankability. I think that's your screen. Is that your screen or my screen? Somebody's sharing their screen. Okay. So I'm working on an economic imbalance story where big companies are having access to green loans due to their bankability, while SMEs are being left to, I guess, well, at the sidelines. As far as SMEs are concerned, I only have unreplied emails as evidence that the banks are ignoring them. Is that not enough? Is that not enough evidence? Is the question for them to go with the fact that the banks are just not responding to the SMEs?
So yeah, as an editor, my question would be here: what's the wrongdoing specifically? Like, are the banks supposed to respond to SMEs? And if so, why? Is the program not one for companies that are of a certain size and bigger? There's a lot of questions that come up from this scenario. But the fundamental question is a lack of response a source? And I think it can be. If you've got proof that a lot of emails were sent and that a response, you'd have to say that, a response is reasonably expected and part of like the mandate, part of the rules, part of what is expected of this institution, in this instance, a bank, and that their lack of response is a contravention of what the rules are and of what they should have done. And therefore, that absence. But earlier we were talking about using a right of reply as a means of gathering information. This is a perfect example of where that would be a very interesting and valuable thing to do. Because what is a right of reply? It's a solicitation of a response. So so do you see where I'm going with this? If all of these small and medium enterprises have been emailing the bank without a response, what I would do is I would collate all those questions. I'd say we've got 30 emails here that you haven't responded to. I'm sending you a formal right of reply email asking you whether you indeed haven't responded to them, and if so, why not? And do you see if they're either going to respond, and that's going to give you more context to the story. So then you'll have their side of the thing compared to what the other side was. It's always good to get more information rather than less, even if it comes from the target of, in fact, specifically if it comes from the target of your investigation, because it provides balance to what you're reporting. But, if they don't respond, then isn't that just a great story element? You've got these 30 emails that haven't been responded to. You collated them and you sent it all to the PR office, and they still didn't respond. So there's obviously an issue of non-response coming from this bank, and then you can kind of write your story around the fact. This is what I mean by kind of thinking creatively about what you can do with the source material, even if it is limited at your disposal.
Daniel, if I can add to what
see.
Please.
Sorry, briefly. I think in writing to the bank, the first question you should ask is, do you have a policy on answering emails?
Absolutely.
So we're talking about creative ways to ask the questions to tease them out. The likelihood is most banks would say, yes, the rule is you have to reply within 48 hours. You've got them, because then you say, well, here's 30 you haven't replied to, kindly explain. So the way you approach the bank also can help take your story forward.
Yeah, and sometimes asking questions to which you already know the answer to. You might have the policy in your hand. They don't know that. So you ask them, do you have a policy and where is it? And if they try and obfuscate, then you can say, well, here it is. So why didn't you give it to me? Do you see what I mean? It's how you phrase it, as Anton says, to get what you need. It's about investigative journalism is often about creativity and approaching the gathering of information creatively, anticipating already how it's going to look on the page when you transcribe or translate your process to your reader. Ndapo Eshali? Well, Ndapo Eshali, I'm going to just drop my email address in the chat because it wasn't on my presentation. If anybody didn't have their question properly answered, I might be guilty of that, or if they've got something to follow up on, just please go to the chat. I think you can see it. Anton can confirm for me. And you can just copy and paste that. And if you want to be alerted to our opportunity, which we will be announcing and broadcasting as of tomorrow or early next week for
Okay.
pitching.
Thanks, Danielle. There was a question from Elaine about where to get documents, but you'd actually answered that question a little bit earlier. So I think just because we are running out of time, but I have shared your email address as well. So if any of your questions need fuller explanations, as Danielle said, you can reach out to him. And then I've also shared the opportunities. And again, for everybody who could attend and who could not attend, but has registered, we will share an email by the end of next week with the uploaded video and Daniel's presentation, tip sheet, etc. And so you'll have that answered. Otherwise, and the email address, we'll put that in there as well. Okay. Anton, would you like to close us off with some words of wisdom?
Just a big thank you to Danielle. I think we've covered some very important ground. I hope everyone found it useful, and thank you for taking the time and trouble to be with us. And we look forward to seeing your pictures and working with you in the coming year.